Good morning, Bogdan.
Good morning.
Well, I'm not sure exactly when Dr. Holmes is going to join us to do her teaching on social media and marketing today. So I want to go ahead and get started to make sure she has adequate time for covering whatever she wants to cover. I am sharing a screen. Are you seeing a map of the world called Fortinet right now?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this before, but this is a live tracking of cyber attacks going on in the world right now. So these aren't bombs. These are attacks against Microsoft and against Apple, against nations. And I don't know how these are tracked, but somehow they are. And you can see there's a lot of activity going on in the United States. A lot of that's being aimed at the Bay Area of California, where we have Apple and Google, and we've got a lot of attacks going into Seattle, where we've got Microsoft. I'm not sure what that's in the middle of the nation, probably a data port for somebody. It looks like that might be Kansas City or Oklahoma City in the States. But I show you this map just to give you an idea of how active these issues are every day. And this is why we have firewalls in our systems. This is why we have virus controls, on our computers and for our emails, so that we can avoid getting hacked, and have our computer held hostage and our files held hostage by ransomware and such. I know there was an instance of a dentist here in the United States who had an open Wi-Fi system, and she didn't lock that down at night. And one of her patients who had access to that Wi-Fi and had the code would go out into a parking lot at night, back in the days when it was easy to download music illegally. And she downloaded, the patient did all kinds of music. I mean, and the dentist, since her Wi-Fi system had been accessed to download that illegal activity, she was held legally responsible for that. And I think she got fined like $25,000 for that. So this is just a good reminder that when you set up your information system in your office, my goodness, make sure you've got firewalls and other things in control so that you're protected. I know there's a firm in the Midwest called Medix, MEDIX, and they speak in my course, and that's part of what they do, is provide that kind of security for dental offices. So yesterday we talked and introduced the concept of marketing. And I told you that maybe 6, 8, 10 times a year we get a marketing flyer from a dentist in the mail. And so here we go. This came yesterday. So these are real. People are still sending out these kinds of flyers. So this is for Star City Dental. And we talked about different messages that you can send your patients. In this case, patients are a priority, state-of-the-art advanced technology, state-of-the-art facilities, and so forth. And so they're really trying to attract patients through this kind of a flyer. And there's additional information on the back, including the dentists. Both of these dentists I know. They're both alums of our dental college. And one of the dentists, the one, Dr. Hungerford here, she teaches part-time at our school, as does her dad, who owns a big group practice in Manhattan, Kansas, which is just about 3 hours drive south of Lincoln. Now, in sending out that flyer, they're paying for printing, right? They're paying for postage, and they were probably going to track how many patients they get through that kind of a marketing effort. If they get 1 or 2 out of 100 patients calling, and 1 or 2 actually showing up for an appointment through that kind of a flyer, that would be a successful flyer, because people don't respond necessarily to these. I know this is the second one we've gotten in about a month or two. So some dentists are still using that kind of marketing to get their name out and their word out and their identity out there into the public's mind. And again, they're sending multiple messages of those kinds of flyers. So you all navigated successfully the dentalcare.com website. Sometimes it's difficult to create an account. I wondered maybe if there was something going on between Apple and their website, but at any rate, I'm glad you all eventually got in. And now you've got an account. And so the second course that I assigned that's not due till next Wednesday is out there and available for you whenever you want to work on that outside of class time. You all did very well. I didn't tell you in that dentalcare.com course, I think you have to get a minimum of 70 to get a certificate and pass. But all your scores eventually posted, and so that's good. So I grabbed those and put those in my grade chart that I'm going to give to Dr. Jones when the course is done. Trying to share a screen of an email and it's not wanting to let me share that. Let me try again. There it is. So are you seeing an email?
Yes.
Okay. So I had mentioned to you, you can get emails from the Levin Group, a practice tip of the day if you're interested in that. And if you're never not interested, you could always unsubscribe. But his email for today is timely because it relates to financial analysis, which we introduced yesterday. I have a PowerPoint on that today. But the email says simply measure, measure, measure. In a crisis like COVID-19, you must focus on the most important measurements every day. Waiting a month may be too long and cause negative effects for your practice. During this time, it will help to focus on fewer but very few specific key performance indicators such as production, collection, income, expenses, number of new patients, number of active patients, and number of patients to be reactivated. And so that kind of parallels what we're going to talk about again today with financial analysis. I wanted to make a just kind of a general comment about the course on goal setting, creating a blueprint to achieve total professional success that you completed. I think that's a good course just to understand the basics of goal setting and its importance, and you set goals in the simulation. And I had shown you a photograph of Dr. Holmes's break room for her staff where practice goals were listed as well as individual goals for the year, personal kinds of goals like trips and that kind of thing. One really important dimension in life was not mentioned at all in those goals. Dr. Schwartz, who wrote that course, talked about physical goals and exercise, and talked about personal goals and financial goals for yourself and your practice, your family, those kinds of issues. Can anybody think of a dimension in life that may be important to some of us that was not mentioned in that course? If I was there in person, I'd give you $1 if you got it right, but I can't do that now. So what I have in mind here, a dimension in life that was not discussed in that course, was a spiritual dimension. Do you have faith? How does that relate to the other goals that you develop? I mean, for my wife and I, that would be the first step we would take to establish any of the other goals that are discussed in that course. And so now I'm kind of in a pre-retirement stage. And so we're praying a lot about that. We pray about whether to go to Jamaica and teach every year. We pray about lots of things in life. And so for some of us, that's just an important foundation from which those other goals may arise or be redefined over time. And so I just wanted to mention, for those of you who have faith and that's important to your life, you know, certainly that's something that's going to influence the goals that you develop over time and how you modify them as well. For today's class, I flipped the order of the PowerPoints. Originally, we were supposed to talk about debt management for quarter 6, but because we're introducing financial analysis yesterday and today, I wanted to go over the basic financial analysis PowerPoint, which will reinforce the video that we saw yesterday, and I went in and modified this PowerPoint for this morning to emphasize these key points in financial analysis. So let me see if I can get that PowerPoint to share with you. Okay, so hopefully I'm sharing the financial analysis and that you can see that. So the basic analysis formula for financial analysis is to figure out what your overhead is, and that's just total costs, which are listed at the very bottom left side of every quarter printout, and you divide that into your collections, or total revenue if you prefer that, per quarter. So that will result in a percentage, and that percentage is your overhead, the cost of doing business. On a percentage basis, that could go anywhere from sometimes 30 or 40 or 50 all the way up to maybe 70 or 80. In the case of a new practice, the overhead can even be, your costs here might be even more than your collections. So this can go over 100%. Hopefully it doesn't stay there long. And this just kind of depicts from the basic simulation report, which is a little simpler than the one you're getting in the advanced game. But we see total collections up here, and we see total collections here, total expenses down here, and then the difference is the amount of profit or loss that the practice had for that quarter. In this case, they had a profit of $1,712. So overhead is costs over production. Profit then is collections minus costs, and then divided into collections again. Or a simpler way to look at profit is out of 100%, after you take out overhead, what's left over. So if overhead's 70%, profit's 30. If overhead is 60%, profit's 40. If overhead is 50, profit's 50. For a mature dental practice, any overhead over 65% would be considered high, on the high end. The average, I think I've showed you before, is between 60 and 70%. But a practice that's certainly been around for 5 to 10 years, if that overhead's running 65, 70, 75%, that would be considered quite high. Average would be around 55 to 65%, and low would be about 55%. You may remember that Dr. Colleen was shooting for a goal of 55%. And you got to remember that his practice has only been open, his newer practice, about a year. So he's far from mature as a practice, but he's still shooting for that fairly low percentage for his business expenses overhead of 55%. It says here that growing practices, you're going to have a higher overhead. This is one of the reasons I didn't get into financial analysis with you early, because in your first year, your practice is still growing and your expenses are going to be comparatively higher than they will be like in year 2 and 3, because you're going to bring in more revenue in years 2 or 3, even though your expenses may not go up as much. Specialty practices tend to have much lower overhead. And so I'm not sure that Lisa has had a what's your overhead, dad discussion with her dad as an orthodontist, but it's very common for an orthodontic practice to have an overhead of 50% or less. Orthodontists tend to have a lot of staff, but their lab bill tends to be very low. unless they're doing something like Invisalign, and even then compared to a general practice or a practice doing a lot of crown and bridge, that portion of their overhead tends to be very low. Oral surgery tends to have lower overhead, in part because they're generating so much money that compensates for any expenses that they have. Of the specialties, what specialty do you suppose has historically about the lowest overhead? Anybody know?
Not sure.
Anybody want to hazard a guess? So, uh, historically, usually endo has very low overhead. If you think about it, an endodontist probably isn't going to be doing 2 endo procedures at a time, right? In general practice, you could have a couple of assistants in chairs next to each other, and you could rotate between the patients in terms of anesthetizing, prepping a crown, fabricating a temporary, and so forth, and go back between 2 or 3 chairs. Endodontist is probably going to have that 1 chair and 1 assistant, and in most practices, probably 1 receptionist. So their staff costs are really low, and their lab costs are really low for the most part. Maybe they're placing implants and that would push it up. But it's common for an endodontist to have an overhead of 45%, or maybe even a little less, plus or minus 45%, which compared to a general practice is very low. And so endodontists, maybe they're going to generate $1 million a year, but you got to realize if they only have $450,000 in costs, they're making a lot of money, a lot of profit out of that practice. So I want you to understand that overhead isn't necessarily good or bad. You got to figure out what you're spending and does that help you become more profitable. So right now in the simulation, you all have growing pains. Gosh, do I add another operatory, and does that increase my interest and my loan payment? And yes, it does. And does it increase your overhead and cost to add new staff and pay them? Yes, it does. But if by adding that chair and adding that staff member, if your production goes up and your collection goes up to more than compensate for those increased expenses, overhead is good. It's just a cost of doing business. Bad overhead, might be using a lab that's too expensive. It might be having too many staff, which is a common mistake in the simulation that you all are not making. At the end of the simulation this last semester, there was 1 practice of the 17 that we had in the room. Got to realize we have a class of about 50. And so I have them usually in groups of 2 and 3. But there was 1 practice at the end of the simulation when I did their kind of assessment at the end. They had 1.5 staff more than they should have. Remember we talked about that ratio, 1 clinical staff member full-time, whether a hygienist or an assistant per chair. And in this case, they had 1.5 clinical staff above that staffing pattern. And as a result, their overhead was about 72%, 73%. And if their staffing had been down to the level that it should have been, their overhead would have been probably 65%, more like in the average range. And so if there are costs there that you shouldn't be incurring, obviously that's bad overhead, because if you're paying staff and they have no chair to work out of, that's not going to help your practice. So part of financial analysis, critical success factors, or sometimes these are called financial indicators, same kind of concept. Ask yourself if your production's okay. Are you collecting the money that's owed to you? Are you generating patients for the practice? Are costs in line, especially staffing costs? And are your staff effective? And as you look through these, you can see a lot of these are targets that I had you put into your plan targets. You wrote down gross production, you wrote down net production, you wrote down collections, what you're going to generate, you indicated how many new patients you're going to have in quarter 12, and so forth. So there's obviously a difference between a mature practice and a growing practice. So when we look at these key success factors and these financial reports generated by financial ratio analysis. We need to understand that your practices, this is only the 5th quarter that you're into them. And so some of the targets that you might reach in quarter 10, 11, or 12 are probably not going to be reached by quarter 5 or 6. And so you just need to be patient with that. So maintaining production, look at your office production per month or per quarter. You want it to be increasing, not decreasing. Maybe you want to set up as a target goal to increase a certain percentage per quarter, like 3% or 5% or something like that. As Dr. Willis talked about in his video from yesterday, he likes to see practices in this kind of a range, meaning that your fees are among the top half, or in this case, top 25% of practices in the area. And he wants your facility use or your capacity utilized to be 90% or above. Having said that, I would tell you that all dental practices that are doing a good job of management will set a percentage goal for how often the doctor's chair is full and how often the hygiene chair is full. And in most practices, the hygiene percentage that is set is 86, 87, 88, maybe as much as 90%. It's very, very difficult to achieve a percentage higher than that. Patients, unless they're in pain, often don't think hygiene appointments are very important. And so sometimes they just don't show. They may call and say, oh gosh, I forgot my daughter had a piano recital today, or my son has football practice, and then they just don't show up, or we have a birthday party to go to, and then they cancel their appointments. So if you can get this number, even close to 90% in life, I think you're doing well. Accounts receivable should be about 1/2 to 1.5 of a month's production. So people will vary, in terms of what they say that number ought to be. The tighter your collection policy, the lower this number should be. The looser your collection policy is, the higher this ratio will be. So for example, if your accounts receivable is $100,000, or if your production is $100,000, your accounts receivable shouldn't be over like 150, or maybe as little as 50, but somewhere in that range. I think I told you earlier on a different day about a alum who bought a practice that was generating, oh gosh, like $100,000 a month, but the accounts receivable were like $400,000 or $500,000. They were like $300,000 or $350,000 more than they should have been. Then you got to figure out what to do with all that money that's owed you that people haven't paid. Collection, or a collection ratio or a collection production ratio, same thing. Like to see that around 98%. If you have a good financial policy, like we discussed, that's achievable. New patients per month. In the financial analysis, we'll track that based on per patient per day that your business is open. So this is like 20 per month. And since we're in a quarterly basis, and most of you forecasted like 70, 80, 90 new patients per quarter, which is over 1 per business day. Recall effectiveness, we'd like to see that around 90% or higher, or recare or maintenance, whatever you prefer to call that. So we want our overhead, kind of in summary, to be 55 to 65%. Lower is better. Staff efficiencies, which I'll have you look at later in the simulation. That's a very sophisticated number, but we can look at those going forward, maybe in quarters 9, 10, 11, and 12. Staff ratios, this is how much of this amount, how much does this percentage contribute to this amount? So staffing is always going to be your highest cost, and there's not really much you can do about that. And Dr. Costas' consulting, when he works with practices, his first benchmark is to get that staffing cost to 30%. And then over time, he likes to get that lower and lower. Variable costs that change based on how much dentistry you do, 15 to 25%. Many of you in the simulation are already less than that. Office space costs, which would be your leasing costs, utilities, and those kinds of things, Usually like to keep that under 10% or around 8% or less. Staff effectiveness. Compensation you need to compare to what's going on in your market. As many of you contemplate overtime hours, we've had the discussion before for your quarterly decisions. If you're going to have staff work evening hours and Saturdays, you better be rewarding them with additional compensation and or benefits. Otherwise, at some point, the game will probably sting you or penalize you, and a staff member is going to leave, and the game will automatically replace that person, but it's going to cost $8,000 if they leave for competitive reasons. And motivating team members and building a team. Performance appraisals play into this. On your final exam, there's a PDF that gets into performance reviews in a very detailed fashion. The seconddentalcare.com course, which I co-wrote, talks about motivating staff, and we have 1 or 2 PowerPoints on motivating staff toward the end of the simulation. So we'll be getting into details on these things. And when Kira Dent speaks, she'll be talking about building that good dental team, hiring and firing strategies tomorrow. This is a summary of the simple financial analysis that's generated through the basic game, which I used in Jamaica. I think that was in 2017. And you can see a lot of the variables that are listed here, such as office production, capacity utilized. These are similar numbers that you forecasted in your strategic plans. So this is a blank one. And there's one that's filled out. The financial reports that I sent you for free in Q5, and I'll do the same thing in Q6, are much more sophisticated and more detailed than this. All right, a couple of words about the financial analysis that you received and that we went over yesterday with Dr. Willis's tutorial. I would urge you to just take a big breath and not get overwhelmed by the massive amount of data that's in those reports. I mean, you could sit there every quarter and go through that for 2 or 3 hours, probably, if you wanted to. I don't want you to do that. So what I want you to do, especially these first couple of rounds when I send this information to you in the simulation, is to just focus on big picture items. So again, we're going to look at your individual demand ratio from your quarterly printout. Again, that number needs to be around 1. If it's less than that, you're losing patients to other practices, maybe because you've backed off to managed care, or your fees could be high, or your advertising is not high enough, or you haven't been doing as much CE as other practices. You want your capacity utilization percentage near 90% or higher. And most of you have been around that number most of the time through the simulation. You want to track your gross and net production. So this is the amount that's billable, right? Want that increasing over time, then you want to track your collections as well. Look at your total costs and your overhead percentage. Your financial analysis will tell you what your overall overhead percentage is. And you remember, you set a goal for that, like 60%, 55%, 50%. So you'll be manage your practices toward those goals that you set. And hopefully you'll all reach or exceed the goals that you said that you'd achieve. I mean, if you set a goal of overhead at 55% and you get 50, even though it's a lower number, it's a better result, right? Because you want your overhead as a function of cost to be a lower number. Ideally, you want your collection production ratio to be at 95% or above. You'll have a lower ratio if you're having a looser credit collection policy to generate the patient numbers that you've been generating. Just as a reminder, and we've hit this over and over again, but the managed care market, reduced dentistry through Medicaid, capitation, PPO, is at 55% in your market, and so, or 54%, and so if you just mirror the market, that's probably what your managed care involvement is going to be. And so if the report says you have too much managed care, that may be based on a standard where you should only have 25% or 30% of your practice in managed care. But the reality is that the way the simulation is programmed for you, if you're at about 54% plus or minus, that's probably not too much managed care because that's what's around you in terms of patient pool. You want to track your number of new patients per day. Your financial analysis will have a line item and it'll say 1.3 new patients per day, 0.8 new patients per day. And so that's something to track, an important number. And you want your patient visits to be growing over time, from quarter to quarter. Maybe in one quarter they slip, but if you look at the trend line, we want that going up, up, up over time. Accounts receivable will probably be for most of your practices around 1.5 months production, maybe a little less. High accounts receivable is an outcome linked to a growing practice with a loose credit collection policy. It's just kind of a natural thing that will happen. So don't get too worried if your accounts receivable gets to 1.5 or 1.6, as long as you can keep it managed around that ratio. That's good. As time goes on, we're going to dive deeper into other numbers like marketing effectiveness, how much is it costing you to generate patients, what's your staff efficiency, like there was a number earlier on that chart about hygiene efficiency, so we can begin looking at those numbers. These issues of staff efficiency will begin to be more along the lines of recommended numbers and ratios as your practice matures in the simulation. Are there any questions about any of those items we went over?
I have no question.
Okay. Your incident for quarter 6 is listed again under the advanced tab for student information or student material on the advanced registration or advanced simulation website. Your incident in quarter 6 relates to a patient giving you a cash payment and how you deal with that cash payment and whether you report it or not. I think you probably know that you should. I would hope you do, but that's an incident for you for quarter 6. So make sure you enter that when you do your quarterly decisions. Okay, we've got about 8:40. We could be interrupted at any time with Dr. Holmes to do our teaching. So when that happens, if I'm in a break room and she shows up, just let her know that we'll be back assembled soon. So stay connected with the Zoom meeting, and so we can turn to her and her good insights about marketing when we hear from her. Otherwise, I'm going to have you go ahead and take the next 20 minutes or so to analyze your quarter 5 results. You can look at your cash situation, what you're going to do in quarter 6 in terms of possibly paying down additional debt. Keep in mind that you will have your cash coming in as a tax return at the beginning of quarter 6. So look at your cash return number. For example, if it says you have if you have a tax return of $6,000 or $10,000, realize that money is going to be added basically as a line item to your cash. So you can use that in the formula as you think about how much cash you need to borrow or not borrow, or how much money you may have on hand to pay down on your debt. Most of you are in a situation where now you're starting to accumulate more and more cash and are in a position of luxury where you can begin paying off some of that debt. And some of you have already begun to do that. Okay, so I will create the breakout rooms. I'll kind of stay here in case Dr. Holmes chimes in. Otherwise, around 9 o'clock, I'll start the breakout rooms for your consults for Q6. And again, keep in mind, you'll be credited with your tax return money, so that helps you with your cash flow decisions for Q6. And each day I kind of reverse the order of which practices we begin with first. And so today we'll begin with practice 5 and then work backwards down to practice 1 for these breakout rooms. And so look at your results, get your questions ready. And I did send you your financial analysis. I also sent you your summary reports. So you might want to take a look at that summary report and track some of those key numbers as you look down on those summary reports. What's happening to your gross production, what's happening to your collections, to your accounts receivable over time. It'll just list numbers Q1 through 5, and you'll be able to see very quickly what's happening with your practice. All right? And you have your detailed financial analysis as well. And again, don't get overwhelmed by that. Maybe just concentrate on those few numbers we went over in the PowerPoint. All right? So I'll see you maybe at 9:05, starting with Gervais, and we'll let Dr. Holmes teach when we see her. All right? So see you soon.